Well, hello there. Welcome back to Young Heretics, the show about truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters. Today, I am extremely excited, some might even say inordinately excited, to talk about C.S. Lewis. And I think probably when some people hear me say that name, they're going to think, oh yeah, the Narnia guy, right? C.S. Lewis wrote this incredibly famous and popular and beloved series of children's novels, beginning with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Narnia Chronicles. So I think maybe even the majority of people who hear his name, they immediately just sort of think, yeah, dude, children's author, guy who wrote Narnia. Other people, I think, will probably hear me say, maybe a smaller contingent, but still a significant contingent will hear me say C.S. Lewis, and they'll think that, the great Christian apologist, the guy that really argued for Christianity and for the rationality and the goodness and the truth of the Christian faith. And so a lot of people know and love him for that as well. Today, on this show, I want to make the case for Lewis as something maybe greater even than the Narnia guy or greater than the Christian apologist. I want to claim and argue that Lewis was the great intellectual of the 20th century. And I think when I say that, even people who like Lewis, some of them will be like, huh? Like the Narnia guy? You're going to claim that he is the great 20th century intellectual? And other people even, I think, will probably be like, Lewis, forget about it. Come on. He's this sort of popular theologian. A lot of people quote him on Instagram. He's sort of for kids and sort of simpletons. He's a C.S. Lewis or whatever. It's very common. Even if you kind of have a generally positive view of C.S. Lewis, it's common to kind of shrug him aside as a popularizer or somebody that's just kind of fun, but not necessarily a big intellectual heavyweight. I think he was the intellectual heavyweight of the 20th century. I'm prepared to defend that. I'm going to do it here on this episode of this show. And so to start off, to begin with, I'm just going to talk a little bit about who this guy is. I'm actually not really going to talk much at all about Narnia here today. I mean, those books are great. You should go read them. But I don't think people really need me to explore them in any great depth. And I also think that, there's just much more to be said and explored about Lewis's career that is perhaps not quite as well known now, but is probably, I would argue, even more important than Narnia. So beginning at the beginning, right? Lewis is born in 1898 in Belfast in Ireland. So he's not born in England, but he lives his life in the UK. Born in 1898, lives up until 1963. So he lives through both of the great wars, right? He lives through World War I and World War II. He fought in World War I in the trenches of the Somme, the river valley, so in France. So that was, a huge and hugely formative part of his life, right? Really important that he was a war veteran. And we're going to, this is something that gets overlooked, I think, in a lot of literary scholarship these days, that, we're going to talk eventually about Aeschylus, the great Greek tragedian. And he's another person who was both a war veteran and a literary genius, who saw both of these guys, Lewis and Aeschylus, saw, much of the worst, the bloodiest, and the darkest that life had to offer. They were not just bookish scholars, right? Lewis saw the world. He had experience of anguish, death, and grief. And he still came back and was able to write these works of tremendous hope and inspiration. So a lot of times I think when somebody is generally thought of as a kind of positive writer, and Lewis does, I think, write a lot about joy and hope and those sorts of things, people dismiss him as being naive or not having a lot of depth to him. And before you make that charge against Lewis, you do have to remember that he was a war veteran. He fought in World War I. He came back. He tried to fight in World War II, actually. But he tried to re-enlist, but they didn't let him. And so in some ways, as sort of a substitute, he sheltered children during World War II. He kind of, took children who were refugees from the bombing, took them out of the cities, out of London, and helped to keep them safe. And of course, that's a part of the inspiration for Narnia as well, right? Those kids are fleeing in the same way, and that's kind of how it all gets started. I think it's pretty important to note that he was prevented from fighting in World War II because he played this tremendously important role as a public intellectual in World War II, which we're going to get to in a little bit. And there's a certain providence to the fact that he wasn't able to go out and fight again, because if he had been in the trenches, or rather in the war, he wouldn't really have been able to play the same role in World War II. But he did fight in the First World War. He had been an atheist since the age of 15, right? And this is also tremendously important. So we're going to pause here and just talk a little bit, I think, about the nature of atheism and unbelief, disbelief in God in Europe and Britain around this period. So even before the war, before Lewis went off to war, I think there was an atmosphere, a kind of intellectual air in Europe and Britain of what Lewis would eventually call debunking. You might call it sort of disillusionment. This idea that, all of our old, high, archaic principles like nobility and honor, valor and glory, those are all just kind of naive fantasies that we have and fictions that we tell ourselves about how to live. But really, what really is life is just kind of animal impulses and matter and physical stuff. And this was very, there was a kind of atmosphere in the air, as there is now today, I think, that this was the smart, the intellectual way to think about the world, that to reduce everything to material causes, to animal causes, was to be more intelligent than to have a kind of idea of honor and nobility and these sort of high values and principles. And of course, the highest value and principle and the biggest fantasy of all in that worldview is God, is believing in God. And so belief in God was sort of falling in some respects, coming under a certain degree of scrutiny, right? It was coming under greater and greater scrutiny. And Lewis himself, though he had a childhood faith, he was also an atheist, did not believe in God. He said, in Surprised by Joy, he said that what he really felt, he was very angry with God for not existing and equally angry with him for creating a world, right? So looking around at the world and seeing the pain and the injustice and all of the suffering, he found himself both, angry at God, but also believing that God didn't exist. I think it is actually a very apt description of a lot of atheism. The world wars, and especially World War I, did a huge amount to contribute to this sense in Europe, especially, right? And we, in modern times, today, people who believe in God, myself included, tend, I think, to condemn, people for atheism, or to condemn the atheism of the world, the fact that, the world is becoming more and more godless. We get very grumpy about this. And I think that, obviously I believe it's a terrible thing that people feel they can't believe in God more and more. But that having been said, I don't think we really reckon with what it must have been like to live in the great societies of Europe and to live, especially perhaps in Britain, and then to see just all of your young men, your youth, the flower of your youth, slaughtered en masse in a war that seemed almost to have no rationale, that didn't make any sense to anybody. And to look at that world and to say, there's just carnage, there's no truth, there's no justice, no joy, there's just kind of senseless slaughter and pain. To look at that world and think that, I don't think that's tremendously irrational. I obviously don't think it's the right answer, but I can totally see and understand how people were becoming disillusioned at this period, and see how Lewis felt like, the smart thing was not to believe in God. And so, of course, his atheism, if anything, had only intensified throughout World War I. He comes back from the war, and as a veteran, comes back to Oxford to study his undergraduate degree. And there were a bunch of people that did this that were kind of older undergraduates, because they went and fought in the war, and then they came back and they finished their studies. And at Oxford, he gets what's called a first in the British system, a first in 3 subjects: Greek and Latin literature, philosophy and history, and English. And people who haven't studied at Oxford or Cambridge, or who maybe are familiar with the British system, it might not immediately be apparent that this is a staggeringly successful intellectual and academic career at this young age. I mean, a first is like, to call it a 4.0 is not even to really cut it. To get a first in these exams, even now, and they've made these exams somewhat easier, in order to do one of these subjects, you have to sit through weeks of long essay papers, writing essays by hand and taking these exams which determine your grades. And so, for 3 hours at a stretch, Lewis would sit and write these essays. And then, and he comes out with the first is the top of the top. So this is an incredibly, obviously very successful intellectual at a young age, clearly destined for some sort of academic career, which is what he goes into. He ends up teaching first philosophy in 1924 and then transitioning to English in 1925. And he's teaching here at Magdalen, which is my Oxford college. That's where I did my degree in Oxford. It's spelled Magdalen, but it's pronounced Magdalen. And, Oxford is divided into these sort of smaller colleges. And so Magdalen is where Lewis did his work all the way up until 1954, which is when he went to teach at the other place, Cambridge, which we won't fault him for, but there we are. He transitions at a certain point to go to Cambridge. So he's teaching, he finishes the war, comes back, he does his degree, he's teaching. And between the two wars, he converts to Christianity. He sort of comes to believe in God and then to believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ. And the kind of conversion that he has is what I would sort of call a literary conversion. He does not have a conversion in which he sort of gets argued into the truth of God. If this, therefore this, and therefore this. Lewis was somebody who did believe that it was rational and reasonable to believe in God, but he did not get kind of convinced of God by some kind of proof. He had the kind of conversion that he had was much more about the way that he thought it was good and accurate to see the world. And people might not know that during this time in Britain, especially, there is this kind of flowering, this sudden flowering and unexpected flowering of literary scholars and authors in Britain, very respected literary scholars, suddenly converting and unexpectedly converting to Christianity. And so all of these big names, many of which you may have heard of and many of which we will talk about on this show, right? T.S. Eliot, Evelyn Waugh, G.K. Chesterton, Graham Greene, all of these guys have these sudden conversions. In many cases, the last conversion you would ever expect. I mean, Evelyn Waugh is maybe the classic example of this kind of these modernist authors suddenly turning around and saying, actually, the world kind of needs God. And I dwell on this. I point this out because this kind of thing can happen, right? In moments when entire civilizations, entire populations are kind of moving in the direction of despair and moving in the direction of debunking God and just thinking like God is an old, outdated fantasy. You do get these moments at which the intelligentsia, the intellectuals and the academic elites kind of turn around and say, wait, actually, the true, the right, the smart thing is to believe in God. It can happen. It has happened before. And it happens during this period, which is part of what, this is roundabout when Lewis is converting. And it has to do with the character of the world, with the way that these people are looking at the world. And remember, they're artists, right? Many of them are literary artists. And so they're profoundly concerned with how best and most truthfully to represent what goes on in the world. And a lot of them are reading kind of the popular fiction that's being written and realizing this modernist fiction, this fiction which often takes place in a world kind of without God, there's something terribly lacking from it that isn't true to the way we really experience the world. There's something kind of flat about it. I love this quote from Graham Greene about his conversion and why he converted. So he's reading Virginia Woolf, who, we may talk about Virginia Woolf. She's one of the great modernists, and she's, I believe, a novelist of great worth. But Greene was reading Virginia Woolf's novels, and he says she creates characters who wandered like cardboard symbols through a world that was paper thin. And he just has this sense that the modernist approach is just very empty and sort of drained of color. And that's kind of what people are starting to realize is that when you take God out of the world, and when you debunk all of the high values and principles of former eras, you sort of lose something that's true about the world, which is that it contains all of this color and drama and emotion and excitement. So that's, I'm going to read just one more quote to kind of get this point across. And this one is from Evelyn Waugh, who, as I think I mentioned, is one of the more surprising of these conversions. And here's what he says about his conversion. He says, "Conversion is like stepping across the chimney piece out of a looking glass world where everything is an absurd caricature, into the real world God made, and then begins the delicious process of exploring it limitlessly. So that's Waugh on the kind of conversion that's going on right now. And this is closer to the sort of conversion that Lewis has. He's starting to recognize that a theistic worldview, a worldview that believes in God, is one which allows us to kind of acknowledge the truth of our experience, the truth of our joy and our despair, and not just our kind of material realities, not just our hunger or our itches or whatever, but the fact that we do perform acts of valor and we experience those acts of valor in the world. And so famously, this conversion process sort of happening between 1929 up to 1931. And famously in September of 1931, Lewis invites J.R.R. Tolkien, who is the author of Lord of the Rings and many other great things, but especially the Lord of the Rings trilogy and series, invites Tolkien over. And Lewis is part of, again, I'm not going to talk terribly much about the Inklings, which is this group of sort of people interested in fiction and fantasy at the time. But Tolkien is obviously a dear friend of Lewis, and so he has Lewis over. And this is the conversation. They talk until like 3 or 4 in the morning. And this is the conversation in which eventually Tolkien is going to convince Lewis that Christianity is the way to go. And the way he convinces him is he famously convinces him that the Christianity is the true myth. So Lewis and Tolkien and all these guys are very interested in the ways that myths and legends contain truths that history can't contain. So you can't just tell the truth of the world by saying, such and such a king fought such and such a war at such and such a time. We also have these legends which contain some deeper truth. The prince fought the dragon, and that somehow dramatizes and expresses what heroism is. We need these sort of supernatural myths and legends to get that across. And what Tolkien convinces Lewis of is that Christianity is a thing that actually happened, that has the character of a myth. So it conveys to us the story of Jesus' life, conveys to us all of that sort of supernatural and higher truth that we know exists in the world. But it's not false, right? It's a real story about an actual man who lived, died, and was resurrected. And so Lewis is persuaded and brought around to Christianity by this sort of argument about how the world, what's true about the world, how the world looks, and how we experience the world. During all of this, Lewis is not famous, right? I mean, the other guys, Iliad and Waugh and Green, right? When they converted to Christianity, it was this big public deal because they all sort of, had been already in the public eye. They were already very celebrated. And then suddenly, they announced that they believe in God and that they're Christians. Nobody was surprised that Lewis converted except his friends and family because nobody knew who he was. He was this beloved teacher, but he had not gained the sort of enormous notoriety that he later would have. And he would go on, of course, to become tremendously famous, but he wasn't yet. And it was after his conversion that he sort of becomes Britain's unofficial preacher. And this is why, it's important to talk about his nonfiction work, right? It's in 1940 when he publishes a book called The Problem of Pain that he really starts to become famous. And that's, it's fitting that that's the book because at this point, right, he's becoming the voice of Britain's faith in World War II. So World War II breaks out, and suddenly this population that has gone through hell once in World War I has to go through hell again. And if it was difficult to believe in God before, it must have just been impossibly demoralizing to look at this world in which a second world war was breaking out and try to still believe in all these sort of things like joy and faith and hope and love. And Lewis is really the man who saves Britain from despair in many ways. He becomes, he makes these tremendous broadcasts, these BBC broadcasts, which I'll mention a little bit later. And then he begins to give, these sort of talks and sermons defending his own conversion and his own Christian faith and describing why he believes in God. So this is kind of, for me, one of the core reasons why Lewis is the great intellectual of this period, because he's not just telling you sort of his theories about stuff, he actually, in the same way that he sort of fought in World War I for his body and for the body of his comrades, he fought in World War II for the soul of his fellow countrymen, and he tried to sort of coach them through this time when they could otherwise have just said, there's nothing in the world. And so the problem of pain is the book in which he says, how can we believe in God when there is all of this injustice, all of this suffering, all of this despair? And that's kind of what launches him into the moment of his greatest, the height of his career. So there's two works of his that I particularly want to focus on today. And in particular, the one that I want to think about is called The Abolition of Man. And for my money, if I had to pick, the best Lewis composition of all time, it would probably be this one. I think people who really dig Lewis know and love The Abolition of Man. I don't know that everybody knows and loves it as much as they probably should, but we're going to talk a lot about that one today. That's going to be our major focus, because I think it has just tremendous wisdom to offer, not just for the British people in World War II, but for us now. And then we will also talk a little bit about The Weight of Glory, which is just a single sermon. And, look, Lewis was hugely prolific. He wrote a ton of great stuff. There's so much more out there that we could mention. The Space Trilogy, all of the miracles, all of these books about Christianity and faith and life and so forth. But I think these two, The Abolition of Man and The Weight of Glory, if you take them as two sides of the same coin, kind of two halves of one big thing, then they can really become sort of like wisdom literature. And by that, I mean, the book of Job is an example of wisdom literature, or Ecclesiastes, these kind of mysterious texts that you come back to again and again, and they give you new answers every time. I think that part of Lewis's genius was he saw so profoundly and so clearly the problems with modernism and with the sort of reigning philosophy of his period, that he also foresaw all of the ways that it was going to fall apart, and therefore predicted all of the challenges that we were going to go on and face throughout and after the 20th century. And so these books really, in tremendously clear and kind of concise ways, offer these answers, these roadmaps out of the problems of modernity. So I think you can kind of come to these two texts and get just, almost anything, almost any intellectual resource that you need for modernity out of them. The Abolition of Man, I think of as kind of the negative argument. It's the argument for why relativism and materialism and atheism destroy the world, why they suck the character out of the world. And actually, I say atheism, but Lewis doesn't even really argue a ton for Christianity or even God in Abolition of Man. It's just the first step. It's just saying, look, whatever you believe, materialism, the idea that we're all just flesh, and the idea that there are no higher principles, there are no, abstract or absolute truths, that is a road to disaster and perdition. So it can't be that. So that's the Abolition of Man. And then The Weight of Glory, I think of as the positive argument. The Weight of Glory is where he argues that Christianity is what sort of brings all of that color and that truth and that goodness back into the world, that infuses it with all the life that we know it has. We know that there are such things as valor. We experience them. We know that there's truth and that there's joy. They live in our hearts, but we don't always know how to argue for them. And in Weight of Glory, Lewis gives a sort of Christian argument for the existence of those things and for the meaning of them and the richness of their reality in our lives. So that's what we're talking about today. We're going to start with The Abolition of Man. This is a series of 3 lectures, and a lot of Lewis's works that get now published in book form originally began as lectures. He gave these at the University of Durham in 1943. So World War II is still going on. And that's important. That's the context for this, right? Is that he's kind of making this argument in the context of a nation at war. And it's after he's done a lot of his other work. So the broadcast talks that would eventually become Mere Christianity have already happened. He's already published The Problem of Pain. And this is, in some ways, I think, a more mature and developed Lewis, giving what may be, again, his greatest series of sermons or speeches, I think. And he starts out with this idea of debunking, which we talked about earlier, right? This notion that you can just sort of look past all of the things that seem like high and noble principles and values. All of these things are just kind of, secondary or even just illusory, subjective, arbitrary, right? So nothing that we really have to think of as solid or immovable facts of the world. And he begins crucially with children's education. I'm going to dwell for a little bit on why I think it's so important that Lewis begins here with this in this way. So the first thing that happens, right, in this first lecture, which is called Men Without Chests, he starts the whole thing with this little quote, this little epigraph, which is not Lewis's, comes from a traditional carol, he says. And the quote is, "So he sent the word to slay and slew the little childer." Now, here's another reason why I think Lewis is probably the greatest 20th century intellectual. I think that the true mark of his genius is his ability to wear his learning so lightly that you almost could miss the fact that he's constantly leaving these little Easter eggs, these little references to kind of arguments that you might make from deeper sources than just what he's giving you. He's not beating you over the head with, I've read all of these, medieval sources. I've read Plato, I've read Aristotle and so forth. But if you look, it's there. And I hadn't even looked actually until preparing to do this podcast episode. I hadn't looked at where this little epigraph comes from, but it's from a medieval carol. So a Christmas carol, basically, that goes back at least to the 1400s. There are probably versions of it that seem to go back earlier, but it's a Latin carol originally. Puer nobis nascitur, a son is born unto us. And it's obviously the story of the birth of Jesus. And in this verse that Lewis is quoting, I will read now the original Latin version, and then I will translate it for you, right? Hinc Herodes timuit, magno cum dolore, et pueros occidit infantes cum levore. That's the verse that Lewis is quoting here in translation. And what this whole verse is, Herod, so the king of the Jews, who was afraid of Jesus, who heard about the birth of a Messiah and was worried that he would be unseated. And so he sent out to kill all of these babies just to try and it's called the slaughter of the innocents. He's trying to kill the baby Jesus. So he kills just all the babies that he can find, basically. So Herod was greatly afraid from this news of Jesus' birth with magno cum dolore, with enormous anguish. And he killed the children, et pueros occidit. And so that gets translated as so he sent the word to slay and slew the little childer. What is the point of starting this whole thing with this citation? You can almost forget that it's there, but I think it's a wonderful sort of reference, because the point of all of this is when tyrants feel threatened by God, when tyrants feel that the sort of joy and truth that rises up naturally in every human heart, even in the lowest peasant boy, when people who want power want to snuff that out, what do? They kill and they destroy and they mutilate children. They don't go after the adults, they go after the kids. Why do they do that? Herod, in the story, obviously has a prophecy, right? That it's a child that he's faced with. But there's more to it than that, right? Kids are the ones whom you can train. And today we talk about neuroplasticity. We talk about the ability of your brain to be molded or shaped by certain influences. But we've known this forever, right? That kids can get shaped more deeply and more permanently by the things that they experience than adults can. This is, I think, one of the reasons why Jesus himself would grow up to say, unless you become like a little child, you will never enter the kingdom of God, right? Why is that? It's because unless you are open to having your whole worldview fundamentally transformed, you can't grasp the gospel. And that's what children are capable of doing. And that's why tyrants go after kids first or foremost if they feel threatened by God. So that's the sort of citation here that he adduces to lead us into what is going to be an argument really from very ancient wisdom. And Lewis eventually notes this, that Plato and Aristotle both believed very strongly in an intense focus on early childhood education. They talked about things like the kind of songs that you would sing even to infants in the nursery, because it was so important that they be shaped to love the right things and hate the wrong and hate the right things. That's the way Plato and Aristotle put it. But it was important that kids got shaped to be primed for virtue and for reason. And the reason why that was so important is that those little boys, especially in ancient Athens, who were going to be raised in right or wrong ways, were going to go on to write the laws. And the laws were going to shape the civilization, and the civilization was going to go right back into the public education that then trained more kids. So if you can get to the kids, if you can shape the way the kids view the world, then you shape everything about civilization and society. And that goes in both directions. Kids can be shaped by good people, and they can be shaped by bad people. And Lewis's argument here is basically that the children of Britain, and probably more generally the children of Europe, are being terribly deformed in their education. So he begins this whole thing with a book called, I think it's called The Green Book. And he refers to the authors of this book as Gaius and Titus, because he doesn't want to just defame these poor, children's book authors. This is a textbook basically on English composition, so issues of grammar and form and style in writing English. And Lewis argues that Gaius and Titus, under the guise of pretending to basically teach people about how to write English, are actually indoctrinating them in the trendy values of the day, which are basically kind of relativism and this value of debunking and disillusionment. He basically says, there are passages in this children's book in which we say, well, if I look at a waterfall and I say that waterfall looks pretty, and I feel like it looks pretty, or if you look at a waterfall and you say that waterfall is sublime, we're both saying the same thing. We're both just talking about our subjective feelings, and those are kind of arbitrary, aren't they? They're really sort of anything that you make them out to be. And this is, you might sort of think about this in terms of the fact value distinction, which is a philosophical sort of term of art or a phrase of art in which we sort of separate out facts, which we imagine to be the kind of stable truths about the world, like the fact that there is a microphone here in front of me. That's a fact. And then values, which we think of as these kind of slightly squishier and more subjective, judgments and ideas that we have about what ought to be true. That, thou shalt not kill is a value, right? But so is that sunset is beautiful. All of these things are these kind of judgments about the world. And, there was a lot of talk about this kind of distinction. David Hume famously in the late 1700s was sort of writing about it. We'll get to all of this philosophy on this show. But by the time that Lewis is talking, it's basically taken for granted that anything that you would categorize as a value rather than a fact is just a sort of fancy that you happen to have. And you could easily have a different one. And it doesn't really refer to anything real. When I look at the waterfall and say it's sublime, it doesn't really refer to anything real about the waterfall. And so Lewis talks in this tremendously vivid language. And that's another one of his great gifts, right? Is his ability to get ideas across with this incredibly compelling form of prose. He talks about why this is so evil to sort of teach kids without even telling them that you're teaching it, that they kind of, that none of their feelings really matter or are true. He says, that is their day's lesson in English, though of English they have learned nothing. Another little portion of the human heritage has been quietly taken from them before they were old enough to understand. The sense of having, he talks a lot about having things cut out of your heart, the natural way of looking at the world, which includes a sense that the world does contain beauty, that your response to it is about something real. That sense is being kind of just trained out of kids without even their knowing, or not even potentially on everybody's part, not even intentionally at every turn, right? He's sort of saying that sense is being trained out of kids before they have any ability to object. And he goes on to talk about kind of what the result is of all of this training. He says, I think Gaius and Titus may have honestly misunderstood the pressing educational need of the moment. They see the world around them swayed by emotional propaganda. They have learned from tradition that youth is sentimental, and they conclude that the best thing they can do is to fortify the minds of young people against emotion. My own experience, this Lewis' own experience as a teacher, tells an opposite tale. For every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. For famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. He's such a masterful stylist, right? I mean, incredibly lucid and compelling prose, but at the same time, deep and profound wisdom, rooted in ancient texts, but particularly, I think, keyed to the issues of the day. And we talked a little bit about a similar phenomenon, actually, when we dealt with the Symposium. Back in a previous episode, right, we dealt with Plato's Symposium, and I argued that in many ways, it was kind of the anti-Freud, that Freudianism, which is materialism, which tells you that if you just kind of scrape away all of this false societal accretion, all of this kind of, these fantasies about love and value and valor, if you scrape that away, what you really are is just an animal, right? You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals. Just this kind of, you have these natural impulses, these subconscious impulses that bubble up in these different ways, and that's kind of what we are. And when you do that, I argued, it sort of demystifies everything. It robs you of all the holiness and worship and wisdom of the world. And that's kind of what I argued the Symposium sort of puts back into the world. And I think that Lewis here really is kind of arguing against Freud. The book to read, if you're interested in Lewis' relationship with Freud, is called The Question of God. And that book points out that Lewis himself acknowledges at several points his sort of interest in Freud at an early age and his interests at a later age in debunking Freud. Freud, who was the great debunker, right? The person who sort of said everything, including belief in God, is all just a fiction or a fantasy or a neurosis, right? Lewis writes this about his life as a young man dealing with Freud, because Freud, of course, had this tremendous influence, right, all over Europe. Lewis says, the new psychology, the Freudian psychology, was at the time sweeping through us all. We did not swallow it whole, but we were all influenced. What we were most concerned about was fantasy, or wishful thinking, in quotes. For, of course, we were all poets and set a very great value on imagination, so that it became important to distinguish imagination from fantasy as the psychologists understand the term. And so a lot of literary stylists, Lewis is arguing here, have at this time a kind of sense that they need to defend themselves against Freud without totally disregarding Freud, that Freud kind of proves, or at least, makes it almost impossible not to believe that all of our stories and our fairy tales are kind of these airy fantasies and that they're not really real. And Lewis here, I think, by pushing back against debunking, is really arguing that Freudianism is a way of just sucking all of the juice and the joy out of the world. And famously, he describes the ultimate consequence of this at the very end of this lecture, which I will just read, right? This is still Men Without Chests, still the first part of the Abolition of Man. He says, and all the time, such is the tragic comedy of our situation, we continue to clamor for those very qualities we are rendering impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that our civilization needs more drive, or dynamism, or self-sacrifice, or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. This is still, I think, probably one of the best diagnoses of our modern dysfunction, right? This sense that, well, you really just live your truth. And, my truth is as good as your truth. And really, if I believe in God, that's one thing. But if you don't believe in God, it's really all the same. And then, we sort of do that. We shrug it off because we believe that the only thing that's really real is material, is matter. And then at the same time, we have these big fights over values, as if values mattered, right? As if we really did care about things like social justice. The same people who think that, the truth is subjective are deeply passionate and upset when they perceive a lack of justice in the world. But of course, justice is one of the things that Lewis argues Gaius and Titus are trying to debunk. So it's a genius and again, very, very short, clear, and masterful exposition of the problem. And he hasn't even really gotten yet to what he thinks the solution is. And that's part 2. Part 2 is called The Way. And it begins with what you might call sort of a little piece of comparative anthropology. That, this is where people study different cultures and sort of compare them up against one another. But Lewis compares, in a genius move, compares the wisdom of different cultures to one another. And he says there are actually a series of moral guidelines, moral intuitions, you might say, that can be found in every one of the great cultures and in all of the great literature of sort of around the world. And nowadays you do sort of hear this every now and then. You hear things like, there are 7 universal moral values, sometimes people say. But Lewis goes into the sort of literary evidence for this, and he does include at the back, not a lot of people read this, but he includes at the back of the published version, an appendix in which he sort of lays out, here's the Tao Te Ching, here's Confucius Analects, here's the Hebrew Bible, here's the Iliad, and this kind of array of different texts from all over the world, all of which indicate a certain set of assumptions. Honor your parents, don't kill in cold blood, these kind of, these universally shared moral intuitions, and this universal moral heritage of the world. And he kind of binds this all up into what he calls the Tao. And that's a word that he borrows from the Tao Te Ching, which is a sort of philosophical text from China, perhaps around the 6th century, typically attributed to the sage Lao Tzu. And he sort of uses that word, appropriates the word Tao to mean the whole way of living life rightly and nobly that all humans intuit in some sort of way. And what he's trying to get at here, I think, is he's trying to identify the kind of truth that those universal moral rules convey. And this is crucial, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, this notion of the fact-value distinction in which values are kind of not accepted as part of the absolute truths of the world, it has taught us still today to treat reason as a kind of toddler's game where we just keep asking why. That unless you can point to why, you believe something to be true, you're not actually reasonable. You're not acting rationally. And so you say, well, okay, so you believe that it's fitting and good to die for your country. Well, why do you believe that? Well, because I believe, that the country is a good thing. Well, why do you believe that? And so we have to give these kind of, ultimately we get chased down to these material explanations. Well, because I believe in self-preservation or what have you. And that's what the game of why gets you. But of course, the funny thing is that even when you play that game, you get down to what all logicians have always known. Everybody who studies logic knows that part of logic, part of reason, is beginning with certain premises for which there is no why. There's just this is true. And that's what a premise is. Now we think that the only acceptable premise is a material premise. We can only think that the baseline for doing or believing something is that we have a certain sort of physical desire, physical drive. But Lewis is arguing that, it's just as reasonable to say that some of the principles of the Tao, some of the moral realities of the Tao that we all sort of intuit are premises. They are part of the premises of the world. And so he argues this, in the middle of this lecture on the way. He says, at this point, the innovator, and he's saying, innovators that want to kind of shrug off the Tao and just ignore the Tao. The innovator may ask why, after all, selfishness should be more rational or intelligent than altruism. The question is welcome. If by reason we mean the process actually employed by Gaius and Titus when engaged in debunking, that is, the connecting by inference of propositions ultimately derived from sense data without further propositions, then the answer must be that a refusal to sacrifice oneself is no more rational than a consent to do so, and no less rational. Neither choice is rational or irrational at all. From propositions about fact alone, no practical conclusion can ever be drawn. This will preserve society cannot lead to do this, except by the mediation of society ought to be preserved. This will cost you your life cannot lead directly to do not do this. It can lead to it only through a felt desire or an acknowledged duty of self-preservation. The innovator is trying to get a conclusion in the imperative mood out of premises in the indicative mood. He's trying to get an ought out of an is, right? And though he continues trying to all eternity, he cannot succeed, for the thing is impossible. We must therefore either extend the word reason to include what our ancestors called practical reason, and confess that judgments such as society ought to be preserved, though they can support themselves by no reason of the sort that Gaius and Titus demand, are not mere sentiments, but are rationality itself, or else we must give up at once. And this, I believe, is crucial. We make this mistake. You see people make this mistake all the time. They think that because you can't give a reason why you believe something moral to be true, you can therefore just sort of dispense with that moral principle as if it were just a sort of subjective and therefore arbitrary thought or feeling, right? But Lewis is pointing out, right, there is no morality. There is no judgment about right and wrong without a judgment that certain things simply are wrong and certain things simply are right. You can't just argue for thou shalt not kill, or, you can't argue against killing in cold blood. You have to sort of see and experience directly in the world the moral content of the world. It's a kind of discernment, a kind of intellection that we don't even really know how to practice anymore. Sort of to see something and just say, this is wrong. And not because I can argue for it in some kind of quasi-Freudian way and say, well, it's because my mother did this and therefore I believe that. No, this is wrong, and that's a truth about the world that I am perceiving in the same way that I'm seeing this laptop in front of me, right? We've lost that ability, and Lewis is here arguing for the preservation and the resurrection of that ability. Now, I think that, Lewis is here arguing, again, for something that goes back at least to Aristotle's Analytics, which is one of some of his sort of lesser known works. But, this idea that there are just premises rather than whys, is an ancient and in some senses maybe kind of basic observation about logic and reason. But he's marshaling that ancient wisdom in such an easy and sort of straightforward and even charming and compelling way that people are apt to miss it. People are apt to dismiss him as just kind of a simpleton. And what he's really doing is something much, much more difficult than an elaborate scientific treatise. He's taking the kind of complex ideas of elaborate philosophy and distilling them into this form that is not only easy to understand, but inspiring, and contains kind of some of the energy and the delight that we should be able to take in such things as the moral shape of the universe, or as Lewis calls it, the Tao. And he goes on, again, something that, he sort of predicted would happen. He sort of says, in order to really treat the world as just a set of material propositions, you have to engage in what he calls scientism. And this, again, is an affliction that remains with us. The sense that the answers that science can give, that sort of post-scientific revolution, natural science, reduces the whole world to matter and material so that it can understand the material rules whereby it operates. And of course, that's a perfectly legitimate way to do things, right? You do need to understand the physical causes of things, and thinking just about the physical causes of things gets us insight that we wouldn't otherwise have. But scientism is where you say, and because of that, I don't actually have to think about anything other than matter. And so Lewis, again, provides answers for this that are still tremendously useful and relevant. He says, it is worth inquiry whether there is any instinct to care for posterity or preserve the species. I do not discover it in myself, yet I am a man rather prone to think of remote futurity, a man who can read Mr. Olaf Stapleton with delight. Much less do I find it easy to believe that the majority of people who have sat opposite me in buses or stood with me in queues feel an unreflective impulse to do anything at all about the species or posterity. Only people educated in a particular way have ever had the idea posterity before their minds at all. It is difficult to assign to instinct our attitude towards an object which exists only for reflective men. What we have by nature is an impulse to preserve our own children, and grandchildren, an impulse which grows progressively feebler as the imagination looks forward and finally dies out in the deserts of vast futurity. No parents who were guided by this instinct would dream for a moment of setting up the claims of their hypothetical descendants against those of the baby actually crowing and kicking in the room. Those of us who accept the Tao may perhaps say that they ought to do so, but that is not open to those who treat instinct as the source of value. As we pass from mother love to rational planning for the future, we are passing away from the realm of instinct into that of choice and reflection. And if instinct is the source of value, planning for the future ought to be less respectable and less obligatory than the baby language and cuddling of the fondest mother or the most fatuous nursery anecdotes of a doting father. If we are to base ourselves upon instinct, these things are the substance, and care for posterity the shadow, the huge flickering shadow of the nursery happiness cast upon the screen of the unknown future. And so he points out that if you, in fact, reduce yourself to animal instincts, you will actually lose access to all of the things that, scientists want typically to argue for, right? They want to argue for governed and ordered and rational society, but those impulses are nowhere in the material of our being. They're just sort of values. They're just ideas and values that we discern in the world as themselves. Now, all of the radicals of our present era miss this, and Lewis knew that they would. And I'm just going to close out this reading of the second portion of the Abolition of Man with this last passage. This is, again, sort of from the middle of this section. He says, "Does this mean, then, that no progress in our perceptions of value can ever take place, that we are bound down forever to an unchanging code given once for all? And is it, in any event, possible to talk of obeying what I call the Tao? If we lump together, as I have done, the traditional moralities of East and West, the Christian, the pagan, and the Jew, shall we not find many contradictions and some absurdities? I admit all this. Some criticism, some removal of contradictions, even some real development is required. But there are two very different kinds of criticism. A theorist about language may approach his native tongue, as it were, from outside, regarding its genius as a thing that has no claim on him, and advocating wholesale alterations of its idiom and spelling in the interests of commercial convenience or scientific accuracy. That is one thing. A great poet who has loved and been well nurtured in his mother tongue may also make great alterations in it, but his changes of the language are made in the spirit of the language itself. He works from within. Now, in part, Lewis is quoting Keats here, the great Romantic poet, but this, I believe, is again incredibly prescient and incredibly relevant and germane still today, that if you believe that values are all just arbitrary, then you can make changes on them depending only on your own desire and will. You can just sort of say, well, this doesn't really fit or make sense or work for me, and I'm going to change it. And Lewis says that is exactly like me, Spencer Klavan, trying to invent slang in the Korean language, right? I don't speak a word of Korean. And so if I were to try and invent Korean slang, right, it would be completely ridiculous. I would just be sort of prescribing this random and arbitrary thing into a system which has its own internal logic. But if I tried to invent English slang, I might do a pretty good job of it because I'm somebody who was born speaking or learned to speak English from a very early age. And I grew up surrounded by natural native English speakers. So I have an intuitive felt sense about not just the rules of the language, but how the language tends to get meaning across. And Lewis says, of course you can make changes to, the moral rules of society. Of course you can discern new situations which require new responses, but you have to do it from inside the Tao. You have to be somebody who from an early age has been trained and molded to understand and to perceive the moral rules of the universe, so that you don't just go around kind of hacking off rules without any sense, internal sense from the inside out of why they matter. This is genius, I think, because it's an answer to all of the sort of radical social justice warriors who want to say, well, you just think that, tradition is this kind of unchanging way of and law of the world, and you want to kind of make everybody follow your own rules. The answer to that is no, absolutely not. There exists within tradition a way of altering tradition, but it is not the way that sort of rejects the whole thing, says there's no absolute value, and just therefore makes whatever changes you want on the spur of the moment. And that kind of leads us, I think, into this third section and the greatest section of the Abolition of Man. It's called the Abolition of Man, this third lecture. And it begins with an argument that the domination of nature, which is what science tends to offer, right? Tends to say, if you can understand the way that the world works physically, then you can build technology and you can create machines that travel and that manipulate the world around you and put it under your control. And Lewis says, well, that may be good. There may be some excellence in, bending the world to your will. And people have been doing this forever. But really, when we talk about the domination of nature, what we're saying is that some people, like Elon Musk, for example, right? Some scientists can figure out how to have power over the world. And those people might agree to give you that power if you pay them, right? So I can pay for a computer, which gives me a certain degree of power over the world. I can't build a computer. I don't have that power. Somebody else has that power that I've paid for. And so really what the domination of nature is the domination of some men by other men, that people basically get power over nature, which is power also over other people. And he says eventually, if you trace this to its logical conclusion, if all we're doing in our entire lives is just gaining power over the physical world without any reference to values and to principles and morals, then really what we're doing is we're turning the whole human race into meat to be manipulated, into kind of sacks of chemicals into which you just dump whatever chemicals you want to produce whatever feelings you want. You do see this. And again, it was incredibly prescient of Lewis to foresee that this was going to be one of our major problems, that we now just treat human beings as lab rats, as science experiments, not souls to be, assuaged or consoled or convinced of things, but people with, clinical issues that need to be medicated away. And of course, no, I do not wish to argue against all psychotropic medication of all kinds. I'm only saying that we obviously have a vast overprescription disorder in this era, which comes from the idea that all afflictions and maladies of the emotions and of the soul are really just sort of chemical imbalances to be adjusted one way or another. That's the subjection of man to nature that Lewis was talking about. He says you start out thinking that you're going to get control over the world, and you end up just making yourself into part of the world, one more set of atoms to be rearranged by somebody with power who does have power over nature. And so he then goes on to say, well, if you're standing outside of the Tao, and you're just treating mankind, your fellow man, as objects to be manipulated, how are you going to decide what to manipulate and in what way? If you're a conditioner, he calls them conditioners. He says the conditioners will act. When I said just now that all motives fail them, I should have said all motives except one. All motives that claim any validity other than that of their felt emotional weight at a given moment have failed them. Everything except the sic volo, sic jubeo, which is Latin for thus I desire, thus I command, has been explained away. But what never claimed objectivity cannot be destroyed by subjectivism. The impulse to scratch when I itch, or to pull to pieces when I am inquisitive, is immune from the solvent which is fatal to my justice, or honor, or care for posterity. When all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains. It cannot be exploded or seen through, because it never had any pretensions. The conditioners, therefore, must come to be motivated simply by their own pleasure. I am not here speaking of the corrupting influence of power, nor expressing the fear that under it our conditioners will degenerate. The very words corrupt and degenerate imply a doctrine of value and are therefore meaningless in this context. My point is that those who stand outside all judgments of value cannot have any ground for preferring one of their own impulses to another, except the emotional strength of that impulse. So you just end up, he argues, with people that don't believe in anything except their own desires, exerting their own desires over others. And this is where it starts to get a little predictive still, right? We still haven't, I don't think, quite reached this point, but we're certainly getting there, right? This notion that you can just sort of reshape or nudge humanity whichever way you want because you know best. You stand outside of all of those old-fashioned archaic values like truth and goodness and God and beauty. And so you, the scientist, you, the conditioner, are going to sort of rearrange society basically in your own image. And Lewis points out that if you don't have the Tao, then rearranging society in your own image basically just means following your own kind of base animal instincts, which means that even the conditioners have come back to become part of nature. They've become animals themselves. It's a tremendously insightful argument, a genius argument, and again, made in 70 pages? I think you can read this in a couple hours, this thing, so that is I believe, a great feat worthy of this person that I'm arguing is the great intellectual of the 20th century. So here's what Lewis is, I think, telling you ultimately here in The Abolition of Man. He's telling you that your subjective experience of the world is what makes you human, that it's not just a kind of accident or fantasy or brain fart that makes you see the world as having truth and goodness and beauty and also evil and despair and pain. It's not just a kind of fantasy of yours that exists. It's the very essence of your humanity. And this, again, is hugely important and speaks to a mistake that we make all the time. Throughout this podcast, I've been using the word subjective. And I sort of have been saying, people sort of think that when things are subjective, it just means they're arbitrary, that it's just something that you happen to think, and you could think something else. It's not really relative. It is all relative. It's not really relevant to anything real about the world. But that is not what the word subjective means at all. We use the word subjective to mean arbitrary, but it does not mean that. It means that you are a subject. That is, you're an active consciousness perceiving something, and that thing does not exist except in your conscious perception. So a classic example is the beauty of a sunset, right? A sunset, if there's no human being on the earth, you can't say that a sunset is beautiful because, to whom? Who's seeing the sunset and calling it beautiful? If there's no God and no human being, a sunset is just light refracting through air. But if there's a single consciousness, if there's one person looking upon that and saying, oh, I don't know, it is good, right? If somebody sees that it is good, then the beauty of it exists. Now, it only exists in my consciousness. It only exists in my mind or the mind of God or whoever is perceiving it. But my mind exists, right? Your experience is part of existence, and it's something that does exist and is real. And therefore, it can't just be kind of rearranged, right? It's true that the beauty of the sunset only exists because I see it or somebody sees it. But it's not true that therefore I can see the sunset as ugly if I want to, right? The fact that something is subjective doesn't make it just infinitely malleable or infinitely arbitrary. I mean, I can see a painting and say that it's beautiful. I can see, a mother loving her child and say, yes, that is good and better than infanticide, better than a mother killing her child, right? And that's something that only a human consciousness can perceive in the world, but it's not something that a human consciousness can accurately perceive differently because it is a reality, a truth about the world. The Tao contains truth. And once you reject those truths, you've basically rendered nature dead. You've given to the world that sort of character of deadness that people were perceiving, in this era of conversion. Go back to Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene that I read at the beginning, right? Those guys were seeing that when you suck all of the value out of the world, you just have this kind of dead nature. And that's the last passage that I'm going to read out of this Abolition of Man speech, because he points this out as well, right? Lewis says, from this point of view, the conquest of nature appears in a new light. We reduce things to mere nature in order that we may conquer them. We are always conquering nature because nature is the name for what we have, to some extent, conquered. The price of conquest is to treat a thing as mere nature. Every conquest over nature increases her domain. The stars do not become nature till we can weigh and measure them. The soul does not become nature till we can psychoanalyze her. The wresting of powers from nature is also the surrendering of things to nature. As long as this process stops short of the final stage, we may well hold that the gain outweighs the loss. But as soon as we take the final step of reducing our own species to the level of mere nature, the whole process is stultified, for this time the being who stood to gain and the being who has been sacrificed are one and the same. I dare you to read this whole thing and not find in it both a description of everything that is going on in the world right now and a series of highly sophisticated answers to all of the problems that are going on in the world. I will add one other thing which Lewis wouldn't have known or couldn't have talked about. It seems to me that experiments in quantum physics are beginning to confirm what Lewis argues in The Abolition of Man. And here's what I mean by that. Now, I am not a scientist, right? I do not study science at a professional level in any respect. So take what I am about to say with a grain of salt. It seems to me that what quantum physics is currently showing us is that our observation and our experience of the world is a fundamental part of the world's reality. If you're interested in this, go to Science Advances, which is a journal, and take a look at a paper that came out in 2019 called Experimental Test of Local Observer Independence. Now, science always gets reported in the dumbest possible way in the press. You always get the most reductive, silly understandings of science experiments in the press. So if you read about this in the popular media, what you'll get is headlines like, scientists prove that objective reality doesn't exist. And that's absurd. It's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous inference to draw from these experiments, because of course we know that there is something outside of us that is not us that we are observing. But what I think these experiments are showing is that our observation of the world is part of the character of the world that we experience, that the observer and the observed are in a relationship. So science itself is starting to come back around, I think, to Lewis's point, which is that your experience of the world is real. The things and the things that you experience and the way that you experience them are part of the reality of the world. And subjectivity does not mean arbitrariness, does not mean just you can sort of declare whatever you want to declare, but rather we have to find some way of looking at the world so that we can acknowledge the truth and the reality of our so-called subjective experiences. And that is why I want to get in just at the end here into the weight of glory, because that's where I think Lewis argues that Christianity is the faith that feeds all of that life and truth and goodness back into the world in a way that we can intellectually get behind and understand. But before we move on to the weight of glory, let me just briefly pause and take a moment to say thank you so much for listening to this show. It has been awesome to have you along on the journey. If you have not yet subscribed, please do so wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe. It helps us out, but of course also it will let you know whenever new episodes of the show come out. So do hit subscribe. Also, if you haven't yet given us a 5-star review on iTunes, that's tremendously helpful, and we would just love to have you along. Thanks again for listening. Okay, the weight of glory. This is a sermon that Lewis preached actually before the Abolition of Man at Oxford's University Church. This is 1941. He preaches this sermon, which is then compiled into a book of essays called The Weight of Glory. And the sermon itself is called that, The Weight of Glory. And it is an argument that through the lens of Christianity, we can understand the world not just as a set of material facts, but as a living myth that communicates to us more than just the sort of sum of its physical parts. There's a lot, I think, here of the wisdom of the Romantics, the capital R Romantic poets, whom we'll talk about. Coleridge was an important figure for Lewis, and we will get to those on future episodes of the show. But one of the magnificent things about the way Lewis does this is he, of course, sort of distills Romantic philosophy about the world without ever sort of going into this sort of endless arcane detail about it. And so here's the weight of glory, that to me, one of the great passages of modern literature of any kind. He says, "We do not want merely to see beauty, though God knows even that is bounty enough. We want something else, which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it. That is why we have peopled the air and earth and water with gods and goddesses and nymphs and elves. That, though we cannot, yet these projections can enjoy in themselves that beauty, grace, and power of which nature is the image. That is why the poets tell us such lovely falsehoods. They talk as if the west wind could really sweep into a human soul, but it can't. They tell us that beauty born of murmuring sound will pass into a human face, but it won't, or not yet. For if we take the imagery of Scripture seriously, if we believe that God will one day give us the morning star and cause us to put on the splendor of the sun, then we may surmise that both the ancient myths and the modern poetry, so false as history, may be very near the truth as prophecy. At present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see, but all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. If you take nothing else from this podcast episode or from your experience of Lewis's work, I think this is the kernel of truth that he kept coming back to throughout his career and that he had to offer the modern world as we went on to face all of the challenges that we would face. It is an essential piece of wisdom that the way that you remember things, the way you see them and experience them, that it goes beyond just what actually happened, just the mere physical facts of your experience. That too is part of the reality of the world and is communicating to you some higher truth that is also communicated to you in the gospel, that God communicates to the world and to his people, not just through the facts of their experience, but through the lived reality of their experience. There's one more passage from actually the Space trilogy that kind of gets at this. This is Out of the Silent Planet. One of the characters says to another, "When you and I met, the meeting was over very shortly. It was nothing. Now it is growing something as we remember it, what it will be when I remember it as I lie down to die, what it makes in me all my days till then. That is the real meeting. The other is only the beginning of it." Now, people are probably going to be hearing me talk about things like, your lived experience and think that I'm arguing for just pure sort of subjectivity of the kind that you hear so much about these days. That's not what I'm arguing for at all. I'm arguing that a component of reality, of fixed reality that you can't just wish away or change, is the reality and the truth of what you see when you see beauty and justice and honor in the world. Those are not fantasies. They are realities. And that is the great gift that Lewis gives us in his work. Why do people not think of him as one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century? I mean, maybe I am, particularly going overboard by saying he's the great intellectual, but why do I even feel weird saying that? Even I, who loves Lewis, obviously, when I claim that he's the greatest intellectual of the 20th century, I immediately think, oh gosh, people are going to think I'm dumb for saying that, And why is that? Why is it that he gets this kind of reputation as being kind of for first graders, being this sort of simpleton? I can think of one really good reason why he doesn't get the respect he deserves. And that is because people like him, and people like him because he was able to speak clearly. This is something that intellectuals of a certain stripe detest. People who spend their whole lives studying arcane theory and ideas that can only be expressed in massive, incomprehensible tomes hate it when somebody comes along and can accurately and persuasively convey their ideas in a simple way that even a child could understand. And that was Lewis's gift. It's actually much, much harder than it looks. It's easier to be able to say, yes, I've read all of this stuff, and here, let me cite for you. Let me beat you over the head with all of my knowledge and intellect. It's much, much harder to have that knowledge and intellect and distill it into something compelling and interesting and short. That, of course, there are complexities that you can go into beyond what's just in the Abolition of Man. But the point is not that it's comprehensive. The point is that it's true and pure and real. And this is, again, something that will get nothing but snobbery as a reaction from the kind of upper class of the intelligentsia. And Lewis faced this. He faced this throughout his life. When he was at Magdalen, Tolkien tried to get him elected to kind of a higher position in the university. And he couldn't do it because nobody would take Lewis seriously because he was popular. And there's this biography, which is by Alistair McGrath of Lewis, kind of goes into this at a certain point, and it details how McGrath says Tolkien seems to have been unaware of the hostility that had been building up towards Lewis at Oxford. As he pressed Lewis's case, Tolkien was taken aback by the extraordinary animosity directed against Lewis within the Faculty of English. He totally failed to persuade his fellow electors, Helen Derbyshire, H.W. Garrett, and C.H. Wilkinson, to take Lewis seriously as a candidate. This didn't just happen once. He was passed over for promotion a bunch of times. And Alistair McGrath goes on to say, right, this prickly hostility towards Lewis, occasionally degenerating to an irrational hatred, was also evident within his own college. A.N. Wilson, in researching his 1990 biography of Lewis, recalled discussing him with an old man who had been a fellow of Magdalen around this time. Lewis, the former Don declared, was the most evil man he had ever met. What could possibly, C.S. Lewis, what could possibly inspire that degree of hatred? It's envy, right? It's the envy of knowing that somebody who can kind of shrug off all of the pretension of academia and just get to something clear that average people can understand. There's this tremendous snobbery against that sort of thing. And, look, why have you never heard of Helen Derbyshire, H.W. Garrett, and C.H. Wilkinson, whereas Lewis is this titan in the popular imagination? It's because those people that passed him over didn't know how to do what he can do. That effective communication has made him both the great intellectual of the 20th century and also made it impossible for him to be known as that and to be seen as that in the kind of upper class elite view. That's my argument. It certainly doesn't help also that Lewis was a Christian, which is not a very popular thing to be in the academy either. But I believe, and I hope I've convinced you, that he should be regarded really as the intellectual heavyweight of his period. That is all about Lewis for today. We're going to pass on and just do the mailbag really briefly because I got a great mailbag question that I want to answer. And this is about the Iliad, which we did in the first episode. And this is important actually to note that we're going to go back to these texts, right? These are not texts or issues or works that can just be visited one time. And there's plenty more to say. So it's not like we did the Iliad episode and now the Iliad is over. Please send me questions about stuff we've already covered, and we will go back and do more episodes about them at some point as this show goes on. But here's the question, the mailbag question. How do I reconcile Achilles' choice of glory in the Iliad with his despair in the Underworld in the Odyssey? So this is a reference to the fact that in Book 11 of the Odyssey, which we didn't really talk that much about, the ghost of Achilles comes back. Now remember, in the Iliad, the whole point was that Achilles traded his life for glory. He said, I'm going to die young, but I'm going to have immortal glory. And that's the trade that I'm going to make. And that's sort of the subject of the whole poem. In the Odyssey, Book 11, the kind of ghost of Achilles comes back and says, I'd rather be a slave on earth for another man, some dirt poor tenant farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead. So as this mailbag question points out, it's kind of like, well, that sort of cancels the whole Iliad, doesn't it? Right? If now Achilles is regretting his choice, saying this was the wrong choice, then how do we regard this first poem, which basically glorifies that choice? And, you can answer this question a number of ways. If you don't think that Homer was one person, if you think there were multiple authors, then it's really easy to answer. You just say, well, the Odyssey was written by somebody with a totally different worldview who didn't think that this trade was worthwhile. That's one way, but that's not my way of answering. I think that both poems were written by one person. So you could say, well, that person grew older. The Odyssey is later. He writes the Iliad first, and then he kind of, as a sadder, older, wiser man, he looks back. He says, well, actually, I think probably it's better to live. Life is worth everything. I actually don't think that's it either. I think it's bigger and deeper and more mysterious even than that. In the modern world, and I think especially in America, we do not understand the tragic mindset. We think that a tragedy is just something very sad that happens. But the Greek idea of tragedy has much more than that. And the Greek outlook is much more tragic than our outlook. And by that, I mean, sometimes the Greeks think there are just two fundamentally irreconcilable opposites in the world, and they both exist and they're both true. And that's why man is miserable. That's why man is, goes through all of this suffering and pain. And, the classic example of this in tragedy is Orestes, who has to avenge his father by killing his mother. And there are two moral imperatives there. One is you must avenge your father's death. And one is you must not kill your mother. You must not kill your parents. And those two things are both 100% true. And that's why Orestes is driven mad. And that's why it's a great tragedy. I think that in the breadth of his vision, Homer saw this situation that Achilles was in also as a tragedy. He says it's both 100% true that life without glory is not worth living, and that when you die, you lose everything. And so there's just, it's a kind of terribly sad and wistful vision of the world. But I do think it's Homer's vision. I think that both of those things, both the Odyssey version of Achilles and the Iliad version of Achilles, are true. And we could stand, I think, to learn a bit about tragedy. I mean, you saw this a lot in the 2016 election, where it was like, we have these two terrible choices, and we always want to find some way of reconciling that or getting out of it, canceling it out, explaining it away. But it might just be a tragedy. It might just be two terrible choices. And once you come to grips with that and accept that, then you can make your choice in confidence and in joy. I think actually that, at the moment as I'm filming this, we're having these terrible convulsions about race relations in America. And that's another example of, look, everybody wants to sort of explain away the history of race in America, to undo it somehow with an opposite injustice, reparations, right? If we pay enough money back, we will just, cancel out the fact of slavery. But it might just be that there was slavery, and America is a great country that is striving to live up to its principles of equality. And both those things are true. And once you reconcile with that tragedy, then you can begin to move forward. I think it's something that we really miss a lot in the modern world. All right, there's the mailbag. That's it for this episode. Thanks so much for joining me here at Young Heretics. If you liked this show, if you like this show in general, I commend to you the Claremont Institute, where I work, my employers. We publish two different things, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. And you will love the stuff that is written there if you like this show. Also, this is a great time to donate to the Claremont Institute. People have asked how they can do that. And, it's tough times economically for everybody. We totally appreciate your support. You can go to claremont.org/donate and tell them that we sent you. Tell them that you found out about this through Young Heretics, because that's good for us to know, and it helps us to, build the show. So thanks so much for joining. I will see you again next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.